All right, guys, today we're talking all things forward swing. Where you send the energy here, how your body supports that. Let's dive. Happy New Year. Welcome into 2025. Super excited to get rocking on these YouTubes again. You've probably noticed if you're a loyal follower of Elite Golf Schools, we haven't posted these on the regular over maybe the last quarter of 2024. And what we're going to start doing is we're going to start posting these a heck of a lot more on the regular. And what my oath to you is this. Look, like the reason that we make these videos in the first place is so that we help you through this wonderful craft, this wonderful game. And if we can make a video and you watch it and it resonates with you and you apply those principles and it proves your game, man, I tell you what, I'm dying a friggin' happy man. So my oath to you, we're gonna post these more, at minimum 2 times a month. And what I wanna do, and we've talked about this when we first started building this channel out, is we're going to swim with you here. We'll point the ship in the direction based on what your needs are, kind of a shared, like, I also want to post what's really fascinating to me as well, so that it continues to come off authentic and we're not just trying to make you like watch some random frickin' video. It's more about helping you because of the passion that we have for the game and helping you, but as well, man, I tell you what, when we get great questions from you, it helps us with the content that we are creating, and it's going to help the general population of golfer as well as you. So please ask questions, comment on here, drop us a line on what you'd like to see in future videos. And I tell you what, if it hits us in the heartstrings, man, we're going to start to move that ship in that direction so that we're helping you big time. So with that being said, we're going to speak directly to the forward swing and the differences really between these two types of golf swings, these two ends of the spectrum that we speak on often, and describe each, and what these players are really sensing and seeing in their golf swings. And the big anatomical lesson today is how the golf club is moving in space based on or relative to 2 different planes in our body. Now, we'll put these up in this video as well so you can see exactly what we're speaking to, but very easy to just look these up and you'll see this wonderful image of just a homie standing here with 2 different planes. Now, there's multiple planes. There's 3 different main planes that we can speak to when describing different axes on the body. But the 2 that we're speaking to today are the sagittal plane, which would be perpendicular to my shoulder axis, and the coronal plane, which is parallel to the shoulder axis. This is also important. Today I am speaking purely to the axis of the shoulders, not to the axis of the hips. So when we're looking at this sagittal plane, the golf club for every single high-level player will set up generally on the sagittal plane. It's not like we set up in the golf clubs over here on the coronal plane. Again, shoulder axis, coronal plane, sagittal plane. Now, there's this like massive hot debate, right, on like shallowing. Should you shallow it, should you not? Well, the first question that you should be asking yourself is, all right, this term shallowing relative to what? And for the most part out there, when you hear of shallowing, we're talking about this 2D plane that we've just like placed in there on a player's body. Okay, and most of the time this 2D shape is the plane, the swing plane, from down the line. You'll either see a plane through the shaft or through the hosel of the club and then running right through my shoulders. And it just goes up here into infinite space. Now, I'm not speaking to shallowing relative to that plane, ever. I'm speaking about shallowing relative to the shoulder axis or the coronal plane in my trunk. Now, I've got news for you. Every single player on earth shallows the golf club, but they shallow the golf club relative to the shoulder axis. That's the big key. That's the big understanding that I need players to see. And it's pretty easy to see this because if we swing it to the top here, We always hear about this like big turn, whatever, right? So the shoulder axis, so the coronal plane is being rotated here. So now my coronal axis or my coronal plane is pointing off in this space, where at the address position, it's pointing more out towards the target. So in the backswing, relatively, the golf club is swinging up the sagittal plane to work into the backswing. And you'll see this on tour. Almost every single player will rotate their trunk, and they're rotating this coronal plane away, 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 and then the arms swing up the sagittal plane here. So right here, if I just lifted the arms, notice how my sagittal plane is pointing towards the camera. When I turned and I pointed, and I'm over here, now my sagittal plane is pointing towards the camera, and the golf club is relatively on that sagittal plane. Now, working into the forward swing here is the main map that I need players to better understand. And even though players like Justin Rose and DeChambeau are talking about how they sense or they feel like their arms are lowering here, so in essence, they're going, keep your back to the target, keep the sagittal plane pointing in this space, you lower your arms, and then you turn. That's a map that you see very often. Now, even though that might be a sensation or a feel that players have, and there's players that obviously lower the hands more than others, and we'll talk about why we see this difference in the through swing and like the fully released position kind of out at roughly P8, okay, which is the shaft being level to the ground through the hit. We see generally two different looks and releases. We got guys that look like Phil Mickelson, Vijay Singh, Justin Rose at that P8 position, and then we've got guys that look like Lucas Glover, Neiman, Hogan, Hovland, and they look different at that position. And when we're speaking about this idea of stability, stability in our book, in our mind, is the club, hands, and arms all relative to one another. And in general, can we keep or maintain that same structure through the hit? That's a very precise look at, of controlling the golf club through the hit. If we're restructuring the arms, the hands, and the club, that becomes more difficult to manage that hit space. The control, the bottom out goes out the door, and big time, the thing that we lose the most is the face and understanding where the face is in space through this hit, which would be, sorry, a massive problem to have. So, looking at this idea of lowering the arms down the sagittal plane and then turning. In actuality, players don't do this as much as they think that they do. Even though it might be a great feel or a good map for them to be able to control the hit, it's not what's actually happening. And this comes back to this idea of shallowing. Shallowing the golf club, we see this, and we'll see this from everybody, from about the P3 position to the P5 position. So if I'm back here, P3 is where the lead arm gets level to the ground. Okay, to quickly go through the P system, P1 is addressed, P2 shaft level to the ground, P3 lead arm level to the ground, P4 end of the away swing, P5 lead arm level to the ground again, P6 shaft level, P7 impact, P8 shaft level to the ground. So from P3 to P5, we will see the golf club, and this is just, I'm just speaking to high level players here. So it's not every player in the world, it's every high level player in the world. The shaft of the golf club, where it is in space, relative to the shoulder axis. So again, at P3 for high level players, almost every one of them will be pretty darn close to 90 degrees, either at 90 degrees or a little bit shy of that. So right now, my coronal plane is here, and the golf club will be relatively up this sagittal plane. It's on my sagittal plane. My sagittal plane is pointing over here, so the golf club is generally in this space. Now, once we get to P4, and then I start to drop and turn out of here, we'll notice the sagittal plane all of a sudden is only over here. Here's the coronal plane. Sagittal plane's here at P5-ish, where at P3, it was all the way back here. So relative to the P3 position, where I'm here now, and some players even at P5 are darn near their sagittal plane is almost back to where they were at the address position, right here. My sagittal plane's pointing towards the camera. It's almost back there again at this point. And the golf club has organized relative to that. So even though they might feel as if they're lowering their arms, and they probably are actively lowering their arms. Justin Rose actively lowers his arm. This lead shoulder complex goes into extension for him more rapidly than other players that, sorry, we generally prefer when we're educating the golfing population on how to move the instrument relative to their body. So, point is, the golf club, its general shape, this whole tool, relative to my coronal plane, has shallowed. Every single player on earth that's worth a darn does this, with them actually noticing that they're doing it or not. So, now let's speak to the actual map in our mind, okay? And looking at the structure of the arms through the hit with players that we absolutely prefer. So let's take Hovland for example here. We see the structure of the arms, hands, and club at P8 in darn near the same position that he started at address with. So if I'm here, this is my address position with the arms. I'm saying Hovland looks like he's in here. So in essence, his ribs, coronal plane, has rotated, almost pointing perpendicular to the target here, sagittal plane at the target, and his arm structure is right out in front of him. Now, if I took that and just turned it back so the sagittal plane is pointing perpendicular to the target, so at the address position, look how similar that is. And from down the line, if I do that, look at how radically the handle of the golf club is arcing through this hit. Now, here's the main point of today's discussion to finally get to this. If my idea of the golf swing, as soon as I start to swing into the forward swing, is to lower the arms and then turn, what I'm going to do is get my hands close to me. Rose talks about trying to get the handle of the golf club into his right hip pocket. Like you'll see him almost shallow the golf club this way. He's trying to shallow it, but he's moving these arms down that sagittal plane in doing so. See how deep the hands are at P6 is what he is describing. If I do this with any amount of force or dynamic, as I turn, what it's going to do through the hit is shoot the handle out in this space. So the handle of the club from P6 to P8 is very gradual in its arc. So it will move from here and almost move directly at the target from those two positions. What that means is a restructuring of the arms, the hands, and the club. And in the club face, we'll see this heavy tumble where the club face is radically closing through there, compared to a player like Hovland. Now, here's the difference in Hovland versus Rose. In order to lower the club head, Rose lowers the arms, whereas Hovland will move the golf club lower by riding it down the coronal plane, meaning this way. Now, if you're taking a look at the handle right here and its elevation, boom. See how it doesn't actually lower that much when I'm doing this. And what I'm doing here is primarily in this lead shoulder. Internal rotation, there's a bit of abduction, and if you look at the elevation of this lead elbow, it actually stays a lot higher while I do this act. This elbow actually works up in order to make the club head work down. Now when I do this, notice how the club works down the coronal plane. This is like the craziest, wackest thing ever. Every time that I describe this, it's like, oh my gosh, this is not an intuitive move. This is also why we don't see a wealth of players on tour do this, because from a young age, doesn't it make sense to swing the golf club up here, actively lower it, and actively try to square the golf club? And when I do this, I'm moving the club behind me, and the club face isn't squaring relative to the target. Now, this whole idea here, like I've posted some videos on Instagram, and I mean, people write on there all kinds of different things. Feel versus real, that's ridiculous, blah, 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 blah. This is ridiculous if I move the golf club just this way without moving my body at all. Now here's the map for this move. I've turned. My coronal plane is now perpendicular to the target rather than parallel to it. So I'm here. If I'm going to move the golf club down this coronal plane, I need to move the golf plane, the coronal plane, and rotate it 180 degrees all the way over here. Now, the golf swing is a proximal to distal act. The full swing is a proximal to distal act. So if I'm over here and I've rotated my chest, golf club's back here, relatively on my sagittal plane right now. The ribs need to rotate first, and the golf club, its force direction down this coronal plane would respond to it. So as soon as I start rotating, there goes the golf club working down the coronal plane, and now I'm here. But look, my coronal plane's here. Look at where the club face is. I'm riding this club face down this coronal plane in the forward direction, in the forward swing. Okay, notice how I'm not trying to lower it and square the club face here. I'm going this way, and then into the hit this way. Now, here's the difference in your body's rotation. Again, today we're speaking relative to the shoulder axis, not the hip axis. Players that are actively lowering this lead arm and rotating the club face with this lead arm, their trunk and their head have to stall and almost work in the opposite direction. We'll see this out of Rose. As he lowers this, he'll move his pelvis up and forward in rotation, but his trunk and his head, his C-spine, rotates in this direction. See where my head, my skull points. So at the strike, we'll see this look. This is Rose through the hit. Hovland through the hit, Minwoo through the hit. You'll see this look. See where my head is now. My eye sockets are pointing here. My dome's pointing here. My coronal plane and my shoulder axis has opened more comparatively to a Justin Rose. Also, look at the trunk difference. If I'm rotating, purely rotating this, and my pelvis is staying underneath me, look at where my trunk is in space. See my trunk's axis here. Compared to Rose, who pushes this up, look at my trunk axis here. Two totally different looks. It makes the foot action different. Your leg action's different. Your hip action's different. Extension's different. All of this is different. But what I'm saying and bringing to light here is all of that stuff is just a reaction based on the player's movement in the club relative to the coronal plane. The backswing, the club works up the sagittal plane. The forward swing, the club works on the coronal plane. That's the ideal map for multiple different reasons. Backswing, forward swing. Up the sagittal, down the coronal. Up sagittal, down coronal. If I turn first, I'm rotating the coronal plane. Here comes the sagittal plane, the golf club can work up. If I rotate that sagittal plane towards the target and I let the club work down that coronal plane, I look right in here. And even through the hit, if players hit right here, it's not all of a sudden that you need to square it with your arms and hands. You continue to turn and let the arms stay working in the same general direction. We're not actively tossing that golf club out. As a matter of fact, most players that get here, what I would like them to do is stay in this internal position here with this lead humerus, and this becomes the release. This is not the release. See all this external throw? There goes the club head. I've got to stall this to be able to do that. Because if I continue to rotate the chest and do that, I'm going to hit it behind me. It would go so far left as a right-handed player. Now, if I'm in here, it's on my sagittal or it's on my coronal plane, and I continue to turn that coronal plane, boom, there's impact. From here, if I just let this stay in that same internal shape and it rides right up my sagittal plane now, because my sagittal plane, if you're the target, would be right here, boom, this becomes the hit. See this arm structure? This is the arm structure into the hit. We don't have to now throw it to square it. What's squaring it is the continued rotation of the coronal plane in the shoulder axis. So putting this into action, I'd love you to practice backswing, transition into P6. From here, continue to rotate that coronal plane, while at the same time now, all we're going to do is let both, this structure stays the same, But both shoulders just go into flexion here, and this becomes the release. If I continue to turn the chest and make that same action, that's the release of the golf club. Hit these really chippy shots. Sagittal plane, coronal, release. Sagittal plane, coronal, release. But notice, I'm never tumbling the golf club out. Even when I get in here, it's not release. It's continued turn with the trunk, and now from here, both arms go into that flexion position. Here, there. That's the most stable position that we would see. And if you look at this from face on, sagittal, coronal, continuing to turn that coronal and go in here where those arms go into flexion. Obviously the golf club's gonna shoot out a bit. Look at this structure here. This is the hit. Look at how much that resembles the arm structure, meaning the humerus bones relative to the rib cage, they're maintained for so much longer. Compared to me looking to lower down the sagittal, there goes the pelvis, trap the head and the trunk back, and rotate here. This is a totally different look compared to where I started. So, point is, it's not this feel versus real look when we're moving the golf club down this coronal plane. This looks whack as all get out if I don't do anything with my body. So if I turn my trunk and make the same move, boom, not whack anymore. This is the head with the arms. Continue to turn the trunk. There's all the way through into the finish. And again, once I'm in here, the golf club's gonna release in the hands. In the wrist complex, it'll release. But we're not actively lowering this lead arm to tumble the golf club and square it. Continuing to turn this chest in here is what we're doing. The club is going to release, but look at the difference in the arc of the handle. And we'll see this in those types of players at about P6. Look at where the hands are. Now watch where they go at P8. See how much they arc compared to a Rose who lowers, then turns, and the golf club gets thrown out here. So instead of the hands getting close and then away, we want the hands to stay in front. They'll automatically be away because this is right in here. I'm not trying to throw this out here. It's just because of my chest rotation. See where they are now? See as I rotate the chest where the hands go, but it doesn't toss the club over. It's on my coronal plane. If I keep turning, the hands go from away to close when we're looking down the line. And that's the difference that we're seeing, guys, from these two different looks of athletes. The Justin Rose DeChambeau crowd, who actively lower the golf club and actively lower the arms, versus players who swing the golf club and move the golf club on this coronal plane actively. Hovland, Neiman, Mito. We'll see a totally different look at P8, even at P7, in both of those athletes. So what I encourage you to do is we start to play with an idea of where we're sending force in the golf club relative to these two planes, the sagittal plane and the coronal plane. If you train this on the day-to-day, not only are you going to increase your odds for healthy body mechanics just because of this idea of the shoulder axis and where you're sending the golf club, but it's so much easier to control the face and control the bottom out and control the pressure that you're putting on the ball on a rep by rep basis. Drop your questions below. I know there's gonna be a ton of them on this video, and I can't wait to answer them and can't wait to hear you guys work through these concepts. Talk to you soon. Send some thumpies for me. Let's go.